Welcome everyone, both who is attending this Moot live and to anyone who's watching this recording. As is the custom, we will start with a few moments of silence, some words from the Edda. I'll light a candle and we shall proceed. Jag spigar galla, helga kindir, ner jag minni möger hendalla. Edkväll, jag hade kvällsinne för något av nyss. Jag hade magen mitt saker sinniga gav sitt från den cykel. Hade ajse, hade avsinne helt så en från det fall. Malog manligt gav saker mig som två och räknas sen det med det. Branda att brandi bränons kunin funny kväkista funna mata att manifesta att malikvöda en till dalska att dö. Flame is quickened by flame. A man from another man may become wiser, but from conceit may remain ignorant. Truth, like the skies above and beyond us all. Gods of our peoples and lands, may we spend this time together in friendship with you and with each other and use it to the common good, with profit and with pleasure. I do believe in the distinction between a fact and a value, that because something happened or seems inescapably likely to happen, that in itself doesn't make it right or wrong. That is not the same as should be. AJ is going to speak of matters that can be confirmed or disproved by the citation of empirical evidence. Strictly speaking, values in distinction, like the rules of a game, cannot be legitimated by something that is not also a value. Their legitimacy is their intrinsic appeal and their consistency with whatever other values are being simultaneously held. Lower animals and people who lack introspection act upon those values which they unconsciously possess and are driven by, which may be inferred from the observation of their behavior. I would respectfully submit that those of us who do consider our own values and what they should be, should frame them upon what they actually seem to be, which is a matter for scientific investigation, which I'm hereby asserting as a value by virtue of its intrinsic reasonableness. We should trust the wisdom of nature, trust the wisdom of the gods. What we should do should be an idealized form of what we are inclined to do. Therefore, the scientific project of understanding man is essential for the perfection of man. And with that characteristically pompous introduction, I hereby invite Professor Figueredo, AJ, to speak. Please unmute yourself, AJ.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction. I don't believe it was pompous. I believe it's right on. And however, I am going to mess it up a little bit because I'm going to talk about the relationship between the facts and the values a little bit in an indirect manner. Now, I should warn you that I've over-prepared a little bit because I was all excited by Ed's talk and I wanted to present evidence in favor of what he had said, because I do deal in empirical evidence. But I was asked specifically by you, Stead, to give an introduction and not rush into my copious presentations of empirical data, of which I am guilty, and back up a little bit and explain to people what is meant by multi-level selection. So I have actually two little talks to give you. Hopefully I can do it within the allotted time, but the first one is not going to have facts per se. It's just a primer, kind of a didactic walkthrough of what has been meant by thinkers in the field of multi-level selection. And I'm not going to offer any proof at that stage. It's just a lesson of what the theory is. Whether the theory is right and wrong, you can judge for yourself, but I'm not going to try to prove that theory. I provided the book to everyone here indirectly through Stead, so you can look at yourself at hundreds and hundreds of pages of evidence, but that can't be done in a bloat. Okay, so I'm just going to give that little lesson first. Then I will proceed to the interesting implications for Dutton's rule, and I'll even tell you what Dutton's rule is. Okay, so is that an acceptable procedure for everyone? Okay, so let's do it. First, I am going to share just the first little mini thing, presentation. Okay, multi-level selection, a primer. Okay, this is an example. This is not yet multi-level selection, but it's a story that I've been teaching for 34 years. I find that my students get multi-level selection a little better when I start with this story. And this is a true story. It's not a parable. It's about the peacock's tails and just a joke, the ladies and the tigers, based upon the old dilemma that people bandy around. Fact, peahens prefer to mate with peacocks having longer tails. That leads to the process that Darwin called sexual selection. Okay. Now, another fact, tigers find it easier to prey on peacocks having longer tails. That is what Darwin called natural selection. Okay. Now, of course, you can imagine if you're a peacock, this puts you in something of a quandary. Okay. And the final evolved length of the peacock's tail is therefore a balance or compromise between the two opposing forces of sexual and natural selection. The ladies want you to have a longer tail, but unfortunately so do the tigers. So you see, depending, and this has actually been proven in the field, on the relative population densities of the ladies and the tigers in any given time and place. Where there are more tigers, it's biased towards a shorter tail. Where there are few tigers in relation to ladies, these being lady peacocks, right, then you get a longer tail. So it's easy to prove the dynamics of the opposing forces, kind of like brakes and accelerators. This is a lesson in that evolution, all the forces of evolution are not always pushing in one direction. You may have opposing forces in evolution, and you very often do, okay? As in the case of the peacock's tail. Does everybody get that before I proceed? Okay, good. Now here's where I cross the line into multi-level selection. Similarly, individual selection favors selfish over altruistic individuals in competition within social groups, or what Darwin called a tribe. In contrast, group selection favors altruistic over selfish groups in competition between social groups, so that within a group, selfish individuals beat altruistic individuals. Between groups, altruistic groups beat selfish groups. This is easily demonstrable, but it also makes common sense. So, like the peacock's tail, the final evolved degrees of selfishness and altruism in a population is therefore a balance or compromise between the two opposing forces of individual and group selection, depending in this case on the relative strengths of within group and between group competition in any given time and place. And that changes, just like the tigers. Does everybody see my analogy? Okay. Now, here's Darwin talking in 1871 in The Descent of Man. It is extremely doubtful whether the offspring of the more sympathetic and benevolent parents, those are the altruistic guys, or those which were most faithful to their comrades, would be reared in greater numbers than the children of selfish and treacherous parents of the same tribe. He who was ready to sacrifice his life, as many a savage has been, rather than betray his comrades, would often leave no offspring to inherit his noble nature. The bravest men who were always willing to come to the front in war and who freely risked their lives for others would on an average perish in larger numbers than other men. Therefore, it seems scarcely possible that the number of men gifted with such virtues, or that the standard of their excellence, could be increased through natural selection. Here is Darwin telling us that he doesn't see how in within groups competition, natural selection could lead to these noble virtues. So he's telling us himself, I have a problem with this. How does that happen? But then he goes on to say, it must not be forgotten that although a high standard of morality gives but a slight or no advantage to each individual man and his children over the other men of the same tribe, yet An advancement in the standard of morality and an increase in the number of well-endowed men will certainly give an immense advantage to one tribe over another. Okay? There can be no doubt that a tribe, including many members who, from possessing a high degree of the spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, those really sound like the 9 noble virtues, don't they? We're always ready to give aid to each other, would be victorious and sacrifice themselves to the common good, would be victorious over most other tribes, and this would be natural selection. So here's how Darwin solved the problem in his own mind, right? Selfish individuals beat altruistic individuals, but altruistic groups beat selfish groups, right? Now, here is way later, 2016, a theorist of multi-level selection, one of the major ones. Cooperators, maybe, this is more modern language. He doesn't talk like Darwin, it's not the 19th century anymore. I really like the way Darwin talks, but this guy is talking in modern language. I like to talk about nobility and character and that, but people don't talk that way anymore. So this is David Sloan Wilson. He's a friend of mine. I like him, but he's talking in modern. Cooperators might be at a selective disadvantage compared to free riders and exploiters within the same group. But groups composed primarily of cooperators are at a selective advantage compared to groups crippled by free riders and exploiters. Natural selection takes place both within and between groups. Group beneficial adaptations can evolve if between group selection is strong enough to oppose disruptive within group selection. So that's a little bit more technical update as to what Darwin was saying in 19th century flowery romantic prose. Everybody with me? Okay. This is my group talking in the book that I've distributed to you. Obviously, I can't go over the whole book, but a couple of key paragraphs might take home from all this. Even as the opposing forces of selfish individualism are obviously operative, it does not follow that the processes of social selection are invariably pulled all the way down the ladder of aggregation, such that evolution never takes place at the group level as well. Unfortunately, something of an ideological consensus emerged, wherein individual selection was thought to be invariably stronger than group selection. Instead of imagining a dynamic interplay of vying forces, as I do, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, and sometimes equal in either synergy or opposition, critics of group selection admitted the theoretical possibility of an interplay so weak as to nearly never be able to overbalance individual selection's countervailing forces. That was the consensus in more or less the mid-20th century. I'm saying that's wrong, okay? Notwithstanding opposition and bolstered by decades of thought, theory, and comparative analysis, Wilson, the guy I quoted a moment ago, has moved on, understanding selective pressures to impart directional selection in response to group competition over and above the drag of individual selection. More than this, Wilson extends his claims to insist not only that the possibility that group selection can be strong enough to exist, but that it can sometimes come to dominate individual selection, especially in instances of evolutionary transition. Okay, some more work by Wilson that is perhaps relevant to this group is he wrote a whole book on the evolution of religion, and he casts it in this framework, which is of particular interest to us. This book proposes that religion is a multi-level adaptation, a product of cultural evolution developed through multi-level selection. If society is an organism, can we then think of morality and religion as biologically and culturally evolved adaptations that enable human groups to function as single units rather than as mere collections of individuals? Wilson brings a variety of evidence to bear on this question from both the biological and social sciences, from Calvinism in 16th century Geneva to Balinese water temples, from hunter-gatherers to urban America. Wilson demonstrates how religions have enabled people to achieve by collective action what they could never do alone. Now that's an Amazon blurb, so of course they're trying to sell the book. Let's look at a review by some colleagues who are not trying to sell anything. This is just a paper reviewing his book. It is not until biologist David Sloan Wilson published Darwin's Cathedral that the evolutionary study of religion appears to have passed the Rubicon. Wilson argued that religion evolved because it benefits group. In other words, religion is a group-level adaptation. Despite his reliance on group selection as an explanatory mechanism, an approach that has elicited great skepticism by evolutionary researchers studying human behavior at that time, this being the past. The book did catalyze the evolutionary study of religion. It would probably be overstating the impact of Darwin's Cathedral to describe Wilson as the founder of the contemporary evolutionary study of religion, but his work is surely one of the major influences in the field. So taking home the values, such as the ones that we hold as asa truar, right? Wilson is saying these are group selected adaptations, right? And if you doubt that for a moment, I know I hardly have to do that with this group, but just a reminder, here are the 9 noble virtues. Don't those look like group beneficial adaptations to you? If they aren't, I don't know what would be. So that's the end of my first presentation, okay? And I know we're gonna have a general discussion later, but before I go into my heavy data thing, right? And relate this to Ed's work, right? I wanna see that everybody's got it and is with me as to what multi-level selection theory. I don't find it all that complicated, but there has been a lot of controversy surrounding that by people who insist that individualism is everything and that all evolution is about individual selfishness. And I think that is manifestly untrue. Besides us, there are thousands of social species on this planet, right? And great societies like, well, read the other Wilson, Ed Wilson's book, The Social Conquest of the Earth, and you'll see that there is overwhelming evidence for literally thousands of other social species, some of which has been social for 250 million years. That's back into the age of dinosaurs. So we are not the first. We may not be the last. Sociality is a fact of evolution. And it's not a freak of nature. It is reliably present. So let me shut up and take any questions, uncertainties. If it's anything really philosophical, I'll leave it till later. But if you just don't get what I just said, it's a prerequisite to the next presentation.
Do have a question?
Okay. Am I calling on people or is Stead?
Yeah, was that Peter? Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, I suppose 2 questions. One question is about caste. In essence, if you go to, say, a place like India, you'll find all the castes with, say, an example of there being a military caste, a priest caste, etc. So therefore,
We find that in many social insects as well, yes.
So if you have this, if you have a system based on caste, I mean, that's really selection, but it's the way that a social system sort of can work whereby it selects various people. And the second thing, which is related to that, is that if you take, say, America now, as an example, or a sort of modern country, it has all of these castes, as in professions. It has a professional military, say, and it has accountants, and it has doctors, and all sorts of people in these sort of castes that are profession.
Well, historians and anthropologists have said, and again, you can never be absolutely certain of ancestry, but that all the Indo-European cultures traditionally were based on at least a 3-class system: the warriors, the priests, and then the agriculturalist, peasantry, whatever you want to call it, right? This is true of the Celts, who had druids, and then they had warriors, and then they had the regular old folks. And, you know, it pervades all Indo-European society, which of course includes the Vedic ones. But that's all of us. Lately, there's been a surge in egalitarianism, but mostly our civilization has never been like that. It's mostly characterized by these stratifications. So I agree with you.
Religion. Now you have money. So in essence, if you want a military, you sort of pay for it now, whereas in the past it was more of a lifestyle. So it's still a lifestyle.
It's not just money. Many families in the United States are multi-generation military. If you ask them if it's about money, you might get punched. You know, they'll say this is not about money. This is about God and country, and that's what they'll tell you.
Oh yes, absolutely. So
We may pay them as professionals, but that's not the reason they do it.
fits into your system then. So there's this idea of caste, which isn't a religion, but it is this stratification.
It's pervasive to our societies, at least as Indo-European peoples, yes.
And your system will explain that in, I mean, it's very clear, this principle, but I'm not sure, I'm sure I'll find out how this works in your system. It'll be interesting to see.
Okay, well, read the book.
Yeah.
You have it. We talk about all this. I can't
yeah,
do it all in one day. Yeah.
I can pass it on. I think I think it was Michael. I think you raised your hand, didn't you? I think, unless I.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just a simple thing, but overlooking the whole controversy over Dumezil's tripartite theory, I'm just curious on the how innovative is Wilson when you compare him to Durkheim, and how
No.
Durkheim not.
No.
No,
See, that was
okay.
an early theorist. The thing is that Durkheim did not cast this as an evolutionary problem and did not explain how this could possibly evolve. He just said, this is how it is. He was
This is how
being
it is.
descriptive,
Okay.
but he wasn't analytical. See, Wilson, I didn't bore you to death, but David Sloan Wilson has a whole lot of heavily complex mathematical models for how this can possibly work under regimes of natural selection. Durkheim, although with great respect to Durkheim, just described what he saw, but didn't say how it got there. That wasn't his job,
Yeah.
you know?
All right.
So
fair.
no, it's not that innovative. It's innovative in that, you know, in biological sciences, you have to show mechanisms and not just be descriptive. And Wilson showed mechanisms, as do
Okay.
we in our own book.
Well, he did the research, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's the difference, but the theory is quite similar. So
Yeah.
you're right. You're right on
All right.
target.
Mikhail, I think you had a.
Yeah, I just want to express a little bit of support because, and then I agree mostly, if I understood it correctly, because I read in Alexander Dugin's work, Ethnosociology, which is, let's say, culturally anthropological work of cultural anthropology. And he says, I think, a very interesting thing regarding the psychological concept of identity. And in the sense that individual identity, as we understand ourselves psychologically, is newer than collective identity.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So, for example, yeah, okay, so understand.
Yeah.
So,
So the other, Michael, someday please send me, if there is some doubt about that tripartite theory, I would like to see the criticisms. If you could please send me that. I know this is not the time or place. That's huge. But if I'm wrong, I need to be corrected. And again, that's a characteristic of science. So please send me any information you have that casts aspersions on that theory.
Maybe that topic is for a future view and quite an interesting point.
Yeah.
AJ, could I? What do you find are problems that your students have when you explain the foregoing? Areas that perhaps people have difficulty grasping.
I taught a course on this last semester, and they didn't have any difficulties whatsoever.
Okay. Because I mean, it seems to me very straightforward, the contrast between individual selection and group selection. The
trouble is the controversy. There was an ideologically motivated controversy for the middle of the 20th century. And I think most of us have gotten past that, but there are still residual, there's things that were said that were inadvisable, you know, just rather stupid things that were being said at the time. And now there's so much evidence and so much more sophisticated theory that we realize that there were some silly things that were bandied about in the 1960s.
One brief point on that, has any work been done to show with data that it can be an effective group strategy to have very talented people who don't have children, such as priests, celibate priests?
Yeah, I've done that work. I can give you some more monographs that it makes exactly that point. I didn't want to overwhelm everybody, but I can email you 2 monographs that we wrote on the evolution of intelligence, right? Where we actually show that, yes, these traits and these individuals are group selected, and they do reproduce at a much lower rate. That is manifest. And that's not a new thing. It's not because of modern conditions.
Yeah.
They have always. Do you know that Augustus Caesar wanted to preserve his elite, and he promulgated what was called the morality laws to get his friggin' aristocrats to reproduce because they weren't doing it. So this is not a new problem.
So, sorry, so you are saying that actually it's dysgenic if, for instance, say within a Roman Catholic community, if the very cream of the manhood become priests, that is dysgenic. It doesn't have a knock-on effect of...
if that stands by itself. But see, the societies with those individuals beat other societies. So that's how the genes spread. Within a society, those intellectuals and altruistic people are always taking a beating, and that is not a new thing. But when you have between groups competition, the groups that have those individuals conquer the groups that do not. I know that's not a politically correct thing to say, but you're asking me for facts.
Yeah, we're only interested in facts. Now, I know you've got a certain program, and we could probably talk about this all night.
Okay,
so
yeah,
please,
sure.
Please go on to the next section, and
All right. Now this is in deference to Ed, who I believe is still there. I hope I haven't scared him away. Yeah, there he is. Okay, good. Because this is work I did inspired by some stuff he hasn't talked about. He touched upon it briefly, but he presented this at a conference in London, which is, I believe, when I met you, Stead. It was that conference, the intelligence conference. All right, so here
one of the best days of my life. Really marvelous day, marvelous.
Okay, so here we go. Okay, so Ed presented his own evidence, which was not molecular genetic. And I'm going to go over his evidence, of course, but then I'm going to add to it because I saw this as more far-reaching than what he presented. Okay, so, but I had his permission to call it Dutton's rule. I didn't just do this on my own and take his name in vain. So here's what Dutton said way back when. In an archival study of cross-national marriages involving Finnish men and women, Dutton and Madison, Guy Madison, a Swedish friend, mutual friend of ours, found a systematic tendency for, 1, Finnish men to disproportionately marry women from lower status nationalities. Now, lower status nationality, this is not some kind of supremacy thing that Dutton is talking about. He's talking about that the national economy is as weaker, like the gross domestic product. You know, he's not saying anything nasty about people here, but there are lower socioeconomic status nationalities. That's all that is saying here. I don't want anybody misquoting you. Finnish women to disproportionately marry men from higher status nationalities. Okay. The discrepancy was indicated by various measures of human and economic development. For example, more Finnish men marry Thai women than Finnish women that marry Thai men, whereas more Finnish women marry British men than Finnish men that marry British women. Okay, am I right on so far, Ed? This is good. This is what you said, right? Okay, good. Making sure I'm not misquoting you. Dutton and Madison interpreted this asymmetrical pattern as generated by the phenomenon of female, now how do you say that? I call it hypergamy. Is that how you pronounce it?
Yes.
Okay, you have to understand I'm Cuban and I sometimes mess up these pronunciations. Hypergamy, okay? That means women marrying up, as applied to cross-national differences in socioeconomic status. Okay. This finding motivated us, meaning not Ed, to examine the generality of Dutton's rule across historical human society, wherein cross-ethnic hybridizations are asymmetrically sex-biased towards disproportionately occurring between men from higher status and women from lower status groups, right? And again, I checked this with Ed to make sure I wasn't misstating his hypothesis, because he was talking about Finns and Thais and all this, but the general principle is this asymmetrical mating based on status, the status of your group, not just as an individual, right? Okay. The historical examples of this principle that we found were rarely based on the sophisticated quantitative measures of socioeconomic status used by modern industrial societies. Obviously, we don't have gross domestic product for ancient empires. There's no way to obtain that, okay? But we're instead based on which ethnic group was migrating, invading, conquering, displacing, or otherwise expanding at the expense of the other, which we do have from history and archaeology. We know who was overrunning who, okay? So we assume that whoever did the overrunning was higher in status, okay? We relied primarily on molecular genetic evidence comparing the following for each hybridized population of interest. The Y chromosomal haplogroup data exclusively indicating the paternal lineage. It has to, because only guys have Y chromosomes, so that's only your paternal lineage that's being traced. The mitochondrial DNA haplogroup data exclusively indicating the maternal lineage, because everyone gets their mitochondrial DNA from their mom, period. So that only indicates your maternal lineage. So we, like many molecular geneticists, can compare paternal and maternal lineage and see if they're concordant or discrepant, okay? Thus, by comparing the origins of the DNA and the Y chromosomes and the mitochondria, it is possible to determine directly the male and female populations of origin. Does that make sense to everyone? If you don't get this, stop me, because you won't understand a word of what follows. Okay, think you got it. Okay, research on genetic admixture around the world so far has focused on mitochondrial DNA data, Y chromosome data, and there's also some microsatellite genome data on X chromosomes, but I'm not going to address that. The X chromosome is a less sensitive indicator of male versus female ancestry, because you see the females have more X chromosomes, meaning 2 rather than 1, but the males also carry 1 X, so that's not as good for what we're trying to accomplish here, okay? Using this approach, we found the molecular genetic footprints of 11 well-known historical examples of such cross-ethnic hybridizations. These were each fully consistent, without exception, with Dutton's rule, okay? And here is a laundry list. The Neolithic Southwest Asian expansion into Europe. The molecular genetic footprint of Neolithic Southwest Asian expansion is indicated by a preponderance. Now, Southwest Asia is a politically correct term for the Middle East or Near East, but that's a Eurocentric term, so everybody says Southwest Asia now. But we're talking about the Levant, you know, Mesopotamia, the kind of places where the Middle Eastern farmers came from. A preponderance of Southwest Asian Y chromosomal haplogroups, coupled with a preponderance of Aboriginal, meaning Paleolithic European, mitochondrial DNA haplogroups in Europe, and what follows is a massive list of citations. This is not just one study. Now, probably all of you know that as Europeans, we tend to be hybrids of these Neolithic farmers from the Middle East and the Aboriginal Paleolithic European caveman types. However, what sometimes is not mentioned is that this was asymmetrical mating. Most of the Y chromosomal material comes from the Middle East, whereas the mitochondrial material is Aboriginal. It is definitely asymmetrical as far as European ancestry, okay? One example. Another example, what about the Bantu expansion in Sub-Saharan Africa? Again, the molecular genetic footprint of the Neolithic Bantu expansion from West Africa, which is where the Bantus originated, a preponderance of West African Y chromosomal haplogroups coupled with a preponderance of Aboriginal mtDNA haplogroups in Sub-Saharan Africa. See, the Bantus originated on what we call the Ivory Coast of Gold Coast in West Africa, but they expanded to spread all over Sub-Saharan Africa, hybridizing with all the Aboriginal peoples there, right? But what do you get? You get a preponderance of Bantu Y haplogroups and a preponderance of mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA of whoever was there at the time. This is detectable in contemporary African populations. What about the Indo-European expansion into Iran? Well, again, we have the molecular genetic footprint where a preponderance of Central Asian derived Indo-European, or they call themselves Aryan. That's not a Nazi thing. That's what they call themselves. They still call themselves that. That's what Iran means. Well, those Y chromosomal haplogroups coupled with a preponderance of Aboriginal Southwest Asian DNA, mitochondrial DNA derived from the Arabian Peninsula, which is where these Semitic peoples of the Middle East, derived a lot of their mtDNA. And this, you go to Iran, and this is what you find. Central Asian Y chromosomes, Southwest Asian mitochondria, okay? Because the Indo-Europeans were the conquerors in that case, so they were on top, okay? Now, what about the Indian subcontinent? These Indo-Europeans were kind of busy. They also either invaded or migrated, people disagree, but they wound up in the Indian subcontinent and they made themselves upper caste, okay? The molecular genetic footprint of the Indo-European expansion from Central Asia into the Indian subcontinent, again, a preponderance of the Central Asian Y chromosomes, a preponderance of the Aboriginal ancestral South Indian, also known in the old days as Dravidian, but for some reason you're not allowed to say that anymore. But those are the mitochondria that you get in the haplogroups in the Indian subcontinent. Interestingly enough, the ancestral North Indian genes are predominant in north of the Indian subcontinent and decrease in frequency as you go south, which is why the people get darker. But in addition, it goes by caste. The ancestral North Indian genes are more prevalent in the higher Indian castes and less prevalent in the Indian lower castes. So it's not only geographic, it's also reflected in the social stratification, which is why we believe that the ancestral North Indians were the dominant group, okay? How about the Han expansion, southern China? Just so you won't blame Indo-Europeans for everything. Again, we see a preponderance of Northern Han Y chromosomal haplogroups coupled with a preponderance of Aboriginal mtDNA haplogroups in Southern China. I don't know how up you are in Chinese history, but Northern Chinese essentially conquered Southern China and colonized them, right? And then you have this asymmetrical relation in power and wealth and status where the Northern Chinese were on top. So now as a result, you see their Y chromosomes all over China and Southern China. In Northern China, you still have the Northern Chinese mitochondrial DNA, but in Southern China, you have the Aboriginal mitochondrial DNA that was never erased, okay? How about the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardim in Europe, okay? They dispersed from Palestine in the 1st and 2nd century BC. It was not after the destruction of the temple, that's a myth. They did it in peacetime, right? And they went migrating into Europe, and presumably higher status individuals were better able to do this. So in the modern European Jews, you have a preponderance of Southwest Asian, meaning Levantine, Y chromosomal haplogroups, coupled with a preponderance of Aboriginal, meaning once again Paleolithic European, mitochondrial DNA haplogroups in European Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. This, of course, does not apply to the Oriental Jews, but to the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim of Europe. In fact, we know who they mated with. It was mostly the mitochondrial groups came from Northern Italy. They were mating with Northern Italian women, okay? Way back when in the 1st and 2nd century BC, okay? I think those women are pretty attractive too, so I can't disagree with them. So that's what they did, but that was a long time ago. Even though they migrated into Germany, there is minimal. They lived in the Rhineland for centuries until the First Crusade, but they hardly hybridized with the local populations in Northern Europe. They hybridized with Southern Europe, okay? And that was a while back. Okay, what about, of interest to many of you Brits, the Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britannia? I can't call it England because prior to their invasion, it wasn't England. Again, a preponderance of Anglo-Saxon Y chromosomal haplogroups coupled with a preponderance of Aboriginal, meaning native British, mitochondrial DNA haplogroups in Britain. And that's been attested by other studies. Okay, so it's asymmetrical again. Okay, what about the imperial Islamic expansion into North Africa? Okay, as you know, after the Prophet Muhammad, the Arabians who were in Arabia conquered the whole North Africa, which they called the Maghreb, and Islamized it. Well, that wasn't just religion, they spread their Y chromosomes. Now, okay, you have Y chromosomes clearly originating in the Arabian Peninsula, coupled with a preponderance of aboriginal mitochondrial DNA haplogroups in North Africa, all over North Africa. Okay, this is the way it is right now. Okay. How about the Mongols? Am I getting too tedious, guys? Are you getting the message? Again, a preponderance of Mongolian-derived Y chromosomal haplogroups coupled with a preponderance of diverse aboriginal mitochondrial DNA haplogroups in Central Asia itself. You heard about these Central Asians invading everybody. Well, their turn came when the Mongols attacked them. Okay, and this is what happened. The male Y chromosomes permeated all of Central Asia, right? And there's a disproportionate preponderance of these Mongolian-derived Y chromosomes in Central Asia, okay? People always talk about how many descendants this one guy, Genghis Khan, left, but it wasn't just him. A lot of Mongolian Y DNA was propagated throughout Central, not just himself, although he was spectacular, okay? Now, conquest of Latin America, the Iberian, this means Spain and Portugal, Lusitano-Hispanic conquest in Latin America. Again, you have the molecular genetic footprint of that, a preponderance of European Y chromosomal haplogroups coupled with a preponderance of either Native American or Sub-Saharan African mitochondrial DNA, okay? These contemporary Latin American populations include a whole list. You see a whole bunch of places that have been studied. This isn't just one place. In many places, you can have up to 95% of all the Y chromosomes are European, and about 80% of all the mitochondria are native. It's pretty dramatic. There was no question who conquered who, okay? African slavery in North America and Southwest Asia. Again, do I have to keep repeating it? The European Y chromosome in the case of North America, preponderance in the so-called African American populations, but the Sub-Saharan mitochondrial DNA is prevalent. In Southwest Asia, again, the Mashriki Arabs, the ones that are not in North Africa, but in the Mashriq, what we call the Middle East, Y chromosomal haplogroups from Southwest Asia, but a substantial proportion of Sub-Saharan Africa mitochondrial DNA due to the Islamic slave trade that was occurring in the same time as our own, okay? Okay, so tentative conclusions. Nearly universal validity. You understand I've covered most of the world here. The nearly universal validity of Dutton's rule has important implications for multi-level selection theory as applied to humans. The molecular genetic evidence strongly indicates that the preponderance of historical cross-ethnic competition between human populations has resulted in the nearly complete genetic replacement of the indigenous aboriginal male Y chromosomal lineages of the invaded or colonized by the immigrant male Y chromosomal lineages of the invaders or colonizers. Now, this doesn't mean that this is genocidal. The aboriginal population is not wiped out, but the males are replaced. The females are kept, right? Because nobody wants to throw away a good female, right? Biologically, of course, you could see why there's fitness advantages to not exterminating the females, but very typically in ancient times, this shows that the males were either wiped out or they were deprived of females and the conquerors took all the females, all right? Oh, sorry. The molecular genetic evidence also strongly indicates that these partial population replacements have left a preponderance of indigenous or aboriginal female mitochondrial DNA nearly intact, suggesting that human females are subject to substantially lower selective pressures from intergroup competition, This is an important point in deriving testable predictions for contemporary humans. Conversely, suggesting that human males are subject to substantially higher selective pressures from intergroup competition. If you are a human male and your group loses, you are in genetic peril. So it might behoove you to put up a stiff fight. If you are a human female, you are actually in very little danger of extinction given any kind of conquest event. You see that? So it might not behoove you to fight very hard at all. You might not like what's going on, but you're not going to die for this. You're going to try to survive, and this is what females historically have done, okay? Human females should show both fewer and weaker group-selected adaptations than human males. Group-selective pressures in humans should therefore be strongly sex-biased based upon this evidence. We predict that the behavioral, cognitive, and psychosocial footprints of these differential selective pressures should remain evident in modern human populations, rendering this hypothesis empirically testable. We should be able to test this hypothesis in modern populations if it is true, okay? Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Stockholm Syndrome, where you take the side of your capturers, but that has historically been almost exclusively female phenomenon. There are very few males that are susceptible to Stockholm Syndrome. Just so you won't think this is some kind of sexist statement, let me quote Michelle Scalise-Sugiyama from the University of Oregon. These included manipulating male behavior, determining whether the enemy's intent was to kill or capture them, and using defensive and evasive tactics to sidestep being murdered or to escape captivity. Consequently, to protect themselves and their offspring, our female ancestors may have evolved survival strategies specific to the problems posed by warfare, okay? And here's just an abstract, if you want to see it, of Michelle Sugiyama's work, right? This is not some male exuding toxic masculinity or anything. This is a female researcher taking the female point of view and saying they should not fight. It's bad from their fitness standpoint to fight. They will survive if they do not, and they use other strategies to survive. Males, on the other hand, are stuck in a situation where they might be better off fighting to the death. And here is a passage, another, since I like this 19th century stuff, right? The old story of Horatius at the bridge. He was holding off a bunch of Etruscans, you know, and this is a more macho attitude towards the situation of invasion. Then outspake brave Horatius, the captain of the gate, to every man upon this earth, death cometh soon or late. And how can man die better than when facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods? This is male psychology, okay? And here is an artistic depiction of Horatio defending against these Etruscans trying to overrun Rome. And this strategy is not adaptive for females. But these males, if you're conquered, are going to have severely limited reproductive advantages. The molecular genetic evidence indicates that, I think, unequivocally. So then you have these differences in behavior when it comes to intergroup conflict, right? And there's the Horatius strategy, and then there's the Michelle strategy, where you try to cope and try to survive if you're a female, and they do. The aboriginal mitochondrial DNA has been transmitted faithfully all over the world, practically. But the male Y DNA can get wiped out if you're conquered, right? That is the bottom line, and that has implications for modern evolutionary psychology. And I know what I'm saying is quite controversial, but I'm just putting up my evidence, and I'm open for discussion. If you want to argue with any of this, I'm a scientist. I can be corrected. Science is a self-correcting process. And feel free to straighten me out if I've got something wrong, but I don't see what other conclusion you can draw. All right, so that's my last slide.
Well,
If you want to see any of these slides again, I can scroll back, or we can just talk. It's up to you.
AJ, I must thank you for making it such a wide-ranging subject with so many detailed facets readily comprehensible, and bringing it to bear on a very important matter of of contemporary life. I think, given that one of our attendees is mentioned in the title of your discourse, it will be appropriate to ask Ed if to make a response perhaps first before we ask other.
Yeah, I'm very interested in what he has to say.
So AJ, thanks so much. It was very stimulating.
Okay, you're welcome.
Wonderful. Ed, are you on? I can't see you. Are you on the call still?
He's there, but he's muted.
Please come off.
There we go. Hello. Hi. Yes. No. Great presentation, AJ. As you know, I started off in theology, and I've moved into science in my early 30s, and therefore I'm very much an ideas man and a theory man. I'm not very up on the old quantitative stuff. So I'm always very, very grateful when these quantitative mathematical clever types take theories of mine and prove them or disprove them, but prove them in such depth. So yeah, I have no qualms with it. I suppose one thing that occurred to me, and it occurred to me in the paper I did with Guy as well, is that you get differences within the population. That's interesting. So overall, yes, Finnish women marry men who are from higher status countries, and Finnish men marry women who are from lower status countries. But then you get when the Finnish women do marry men who are from lower status countries, they seem to be more like sort of fast life history strategists.
Mm.
So they're not marrying for status and to be looked after. They're marrying to achieve a tough child in an unstable ecology, and perhaps they're marrying for difference because that child might inherit some useful gene in this unpredictable ecology. So that was an interesting difference. And so just because you do get this variation, but otherwise, it makes sense. The other peculiarity is, I suppose, at what point does the invader become the more powerful? And that's interesting. So there was this big thing in France of horizontal collaboration, and it was quite obvious that the Germans were in charge, and so they were the dominant culture, and so all the women started having sex with the Germans. But then when we have like Islam at the moment, it becomes again this sort of subjective matter of, I guess, for some women, in working class women in northern communities in England, Islam seems like the invading dominant culture. So there's all these anyway, otherwise, I mean, it's fine. It's very, very good. One thing I thought about what you were saying about Stockholm Syndrome and women being abducted. So women are presumably evolved to be abducted. You get this even in very primitive societies, to be abducted in a way.
Right.
And so it strikes me that it follows from that women should be better at learning languages.
That's true. Actually, that was a prediction made by Richard Lynn years ago. Not only that they should be better at learning languages, but they should be superior over and above that in second language acquisition.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And a cognitive researcher actually confirmed that. Our modern contemporary women are superior. Now, first of all, they're better at language across the board. You know, I'm sure everybody here knows that. But in addition, their second language acquisition is even better. They're better at second language acquisition than men. And Richard Lynn had hypothesized that this is not only abduction, but this is a little technical, but throughout the animal kingdom, you have something called sex bias dispersal, as in where, who leaves the natal group and who stays. Historically, even without abduction, females tend to leave their native group to marry out. Men tend to bring wives in, okay? In the vast majority of human societies, and even in some of the great apes, that's the way it goes. It's called female bias dispersal. So the females have to be adapted to potentially live in an entirely different group than the one they were born in, due to female bias dispersal being characteristic of the human race in general. So yeah, that was what your prediction is absolutely right. And it's already been demonstrated empirically. That is just true. Women are superior to men in second language acquisition as well as in their first language. And Richard Lynn says that's because of the marriage patterns, even without abduction. Of course, abduction is an extreme example, but they're always marrying out.
Excellent. Thanks very much. Shall I think a lot of people are keen to
Adam
ask.
has an electronic hand up. I don't know whether you can see that.
He does. I think Mikhail was the first person who had a real hand up, so I'm going to put
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
And
Nico.
Agree.
then Adam.
I did write some notes. So I felt one important thing, which was not biased in the sense of science. The science was, I think, great, perfect, in my opinion, it seemed at least, is the fact that there was too much emphasis on the fact that there can be only sort of conquering in the war sense. Because I can imagine a conquering in the sense of cultural sense, you know, like imagine in civilization.
Well, the Jews in Europe, they didn't conquer militarily.
Yeah, I was also imagining historically what happened with the Bulgarians, because originally Bulgarians were Turco-Tataric, but they adopted the Slavic culture. So I can imagine in the sense that for example, I imagine like a Czech Indologist talks about a great migration of Buddhist priests from India around when Christianity began. His hypothesis is that this is why Christianity came into being in the first place. But nonetheless, if you have a great migration, for example, of Buddhist priests, I can imagine it that the priests, because they are more cultured, they have more wisdom, they teach the native population. And we know that that women, if there is a teacher within the group who has more authority, he would be preferred by the women, right, in the group.
Yeah, and also speaking of India, again, you know, since I was talking to you about the Mongol Tartar-European stuff that I learned as a kid that people are casting doubt on. When I was a kid, I learned that there was an Aryan invasion of India and they had conquered the Dravidian peoples, and people were unabashedly talking about that. Nowadays, some scholars, and again, I'm not enough of an expert to know whether they're right or not, have rejected the idea that there was an Aryan invasion and conquest, instead that there was an Aryan migration, right? And they went into northern India, but for some reason, they became culturally dominant, right? And that is evident today. Same thing with the Southwest Asian migration into Europe. Some people imagine it as, again, a violent event. Other people say that there's some peaceful farmers from Southwest Asia migrated into Europe, and because they had a superior economy and stuff, they became more dominant. Same thing later with the Indo-Europeans invading Europe. Well, we learned that they invaded Europe. Now they're saying, well, maybe it wasn't like that. Maybe they just migrated in with their cattle and horses, and because they had all this extra wealth and mobility, that they became more dominant than the women like them. I don't know, I wasn't there. I know that the stories have changed over the years, and I'm not sure how much of that is based on historical fact, and frankly, how much of it is political correctness. That everybody wants to say, oh, it was a peaceful migration and nobody conquered anybody. Knowing humans the way I do, I'm a little doubtful that all these migrations were so peaceful, you know?
And one question that I have is that you talked about that women would have different traits because of these, because of this selective pressures.
Yeah.
And
they're not going to stand up on that bridge and hold off the Etruscan
I wanted
army.
to ask:
That's not going to happen.
Couldn't we measure that using the the Hexaco model of personality traits? So I'm guessing
I don't know whether Hexaco will capture this. I have some other things. I'm going to do that study. I'm not sure
Oh, okay.
Hetzico will do that. It's not the regular personality traits. These
Isn't it
normal
honesty,
personality
humility?
traits, different people don't measure courage, heroism, that doesn't measure that kind of thing. I don't
Yeah.
think it does. I think
But
it's a
doesn't the honesty, humility factor measure that?
No, I don't think so. I don't
Maybe
think it
Edwards
measures
would
the
know.
so-called
We'll ask him.
martial virtues, the
Okay.
ability to fight, and I don't think that's the same. Honesty and humility can make you a good cooperator, but it's more of a peaceful thing, I don't know that these warriors were so humble.
If you don't, I'll pass on to Adam, please.
Sorry, I'm just unmuting myself.
Yeah.
AJ, really interesting. Can I have your thoughts on this? Judaism has been traditionally passed down through a matriarchal line. Now, I've got this idea that it was, if any of the Jewish women got raped by other tribes, that whatever the child would be, it would still be brought up Jewish, but the other way around, the bloodline wouldn't be diluted if a Judaic warrior then raped another tribe. Can you give me
Those
some?
are modern Jews. You're talking about modern Jews.
Yeah.
Traditionally, the Israelite people were patrilineal, and you can see that in the Hebrew Bible. It wasn't until the 2nd century AD that they switched to matrilineality, and that was because of pressure they experienced in the Roman Empire. The Gentile Romans did not want the competition for females that was being presented by a Jewish minority that was patrilineal and, in fact, polygamous in that they married several females. So the Romans didn't like that, and they said, cut it out. And the Jews said, okay, we're going to reckon matrilineally. But all the hybridization, well, not all, obviously, but most of the historical hybridization events occurred during a period where the Jews were clearly patrilineal, those being the 1st and 2nd centuries BC, fully 400 years before they switched to matrilineal inheritance.
Well, I didn't know that. Thank you very much. That is really quite enlightening.
Yeah, thanks very much. If I might ask a question, I mean, you've spoken about the two different levels of selection, the individual and the group in relation to other groups. Is it possible to give some rough sense of how they stand with regards to how influential they are? I mean, is the individual's force of selection maybe two-thirds more on the other third, or what how would they stand?
Now, see, my whole theory is that it's variable, and it depends who and when. Now, these two other monographs that I spoke to you about that I have not given you, but I can, right? Talk about our own societies, right? Western European, North American, this kind of thing, societies, and what's happened over the last few hundred years. And we have actually documented that prior to, say, 1800, right, the forces of group selection were stronger because we were experiencing from the 14th century to about the early 19th century, we were experiencing what's been called the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age caused major crop disruptions, agricultural disruptions in Europe, leading to many, many famines and many, many conflicts between nation states. And there is, in fact, a correlation published by a Chinese group of minus 0.49, nearly 50% correlation, negative, between global temperature and war fatalities, in our societies. Meaning that the warmer it was and the more pleasant, right, the fewer war fatalities, right? The colder it was, the more resource competition and the more war fatalities over a period of several centuries. Okay, so the Little Ice Age caused extreme intergroup competition, and you can read about it in your history books, everything that was going on in Europe from the 14th century to the 19th century. It was a horror show. There was mass slaughter, starvation, episodes of cannibalism, famine, pestilence. It was of biblical proportions. Starting with the early 19th century, we've been in a trend of global warming, of more peace and plenty, of proportionally a massive decrease in war mortalities and hence an intergroup competition. So we've documented in various publications, monographs, and some papers that we recently published, in fact, that the group selective pressure has decreased and the individual selective pressure has increased and has been increasing for the last 200 years. Yes?
Sorry, have you
Go
got,
ahead, Dave.
sorry to interrupt. Have you got like a measure of, or a series of measures of group selection?
We got a bunch.
Such that you can say by country, this is the most group
No,
selection.
we don't have by country. We don't. The only countries we did were essentially English language, the Britannic civilization versus the Gallic French language, because we did a bunch of papers tracing the competition between these two groups over historic time. And we do have lexicographic measures, meaning measuring the usage of words, right? That indicate, group selected attitudes versus individual selective attitudes. And we've definitely shown this relation for those two. But there are several limitations. One is the languages that I can speak, right? And two is the tool that we use, which is Google Ngram, which mines millions and millions of documents that are online right now over historic time and can tell you the frequency of these words. So we did projects, lexicographic projects on, Francophone and Anglophone biocultural groups. And yes, we have that. As far as other countries, we haven't had time to do that. And also, we don't have the linguistic skills to do all the translations necessary. If you'd like to work with us on it, knowing other languages as you do, absolutely welcome. Let's go for it. But then we have to convince Google Ngram. I don't know what kind of database they have in like Finnish or whatever. I'm not sure. Maybe they do.
I had an idea that there would be a correlation between how group selected the group was and how late it abolished corporal punishment for children. And
Could very well. Yes, could very well be. I wouldn't be surprised. But there's all kinds of things you can do that. We mined some words from Darwin's Descent of Man that indicated altruism. You saw him spouting off with all these words, and we looked at the usage of those words over time. The last couple of centuries, they're declining, which is why it feels so odd to hear Darwin talk about courage, heroism, fidelity, self-sacrifice. Nobody talks like that anymore. These words have declined in the English language since the time that Darwin was speaking them, right? That is not a coincidence. The behavior has declined. It's not just the words. The behavior has declined, right? And we see this in the French language as well, right? We translated, because I do speak French, we translated this into French. And it wasn't just me. I had another French-speaking collaborator that was able to help with that. And we got exactly the same results, right? Now, again, I don't know if this is happening. I don't know what's going on with the Chinese or the Japanese. That's really a different civilization and it's different. I don't know enough to say anything. But I know in the European world and European colonies, this is what's been going on. And we were very affected by the Little Ice Age, right? And once we came out of the Little Ice Age, everything turned around and we've been affected in a different way. The balance between individual and group selection has shifted as a result of the decreased intergroup competition, as a result of the greater resource abundance. So that's our thesis, right?
I have a simple question. So based on this lexicography, how did you define group selection versus individual selection? Like you selected which words, or can you give me?
Well, we did it various ways.
Yeah.
One way, the very first attempt that I made was using these Darwin words specifically selected from the Descent of Man. That was one, because unequivocally, you saw those passages from Darwin. You saw what he was talking about and what words he was using. We didn't just use those two paragraphs. We used the entire Descent of Man. So that was one. There's another thing that I did just recently, then it's in press. I don't even know if it's out yet, but it's in press, right? Do you know Haidt's theory of 5 moral foundations? I know that Ed does, but people here are aware of that. He says there are 5 moral foundations, okay? Caring, harm avoidance, right? Purity, authority, and sanctity. I think those are them. There, I can't remember, but two of them are individualizing. Height is a social psychologist, having to do with individual stuff. And three of them, like authority, purity, loyalty, those are what he called binding factors. And he specifically says that those values are group selected. And he says the individualizing values are obviously individually selected. This is Haidt's theory. Jonathan Haidt, author of all kinds of books about this topic and doing copious research. If you look, you can take his Moral Foundations questionnaire online and see for yourself. And you can get your own scores on how you score on these things. It's a lot of fun. Well, what we did is simultaneously, him and his collaborators put out something called a Moral Foundations Dictionary. This Moral Foundations Dictionary predicted what words people use when they hold these values. So we said, wow, that's great. This was an opportunity for a quantitative geek like me to just jump in and do the analysis, right? So me and actually Maya, who I don't know if she's still here, but she's involved.
Yes,
she was
yes,
involved,
she is.
and she's co-author on this. We mined these words from the Moral Foundations Dictionary with her copious and expert help. She also updated our Python program for using Google Ngram, which was amazing because I couldn't do that. But she's a computer genius, so she could do that, right? Maya's amazing. But in either case, we monitored, again, for a couple of centuries in the English language, the use of the binding moral foundation words as opposed to the individualizing moral foundation words. And we found unequivocally, absolutely unequivocally, that the individualizing words are going up in word usage frequency, and the binding moral foundation words are going down in word usage frequency. And this wasn't just me mining words from Darwin's book based upon my subjective interpretation. This was based on Haidt's Moral Foundation dictionaries, which he published based on his own empirical research of what words people should be using when they hold these values, right? And that came out completely according to our predictions. It's unfortunate because many of us consider this phenomenon to be sad. If you have group selected values, right? If you're asatru, you're not going to like this, okay? But again, this is not about what I like or what I think should be. This is what we see happening. And it's depressing, but there you have it. As a scientist, I just have to report my findings. I may like it or not like it, but that's my own business.
Yeah.
AJ,
Yeah,
if I may shortly comment, but then that seems to me, based on what you told me, that there will be a very large correlation with this factor you're measuring, which is done lexicographically with the honesty humility factor, because that is also done lexicographically by a factor analysis.
Maybe so, but we don't have 200 years of data on the hexaco. The trouble is the hexaco has not existed for 200 years. We don't have the data to correlate it. We could correlate it right now, but we can't do it biohistorically. So you may be right. You may be right.
I'd quite like to get some questions from other people that have not said anything. Father Frank, do you have any thoughts to throw into the mix here?
Just listen.
Okay. Michael from Cologne, any
yes, but I'm a little hesitant because I'm not sure. This is not really my area, and I might not articulate myself very clearly. I do have a question, but it may be because I misunderstood.
That sounds a really good reason to ask a question. Yeah,
it does. This comparison of I hope I've got this right, the dominance of the male chromosome among the conquerors and the passivity of the female chromosome, and I don't have the technical language, but that's what you were talking about. Where I was a little confused was to me, the blurring of the individual's personal interest and personal beliefs and the interests of the group. What I mean by that is, you say that it's a good strategy for the female in a society that's being conquered to be submissive, because in some way, I think you actually use the expression, she wins. Well, she doesn't win presumably as an individual, does she? Or is it just her personal survival? That's one thing. But it's quite another thing, this sort of strategy that this chromosome survives later on, because I don't see how that ties in with the survival of an ethnic group or a race. I'm
Well,
probably putting myself in a very clumsy way, as I say, because this isn't my
no,
area.
that's okay. I understand what you're saying, and I have an
Good.
answer. And that is that, again, you may not like to hear it, but evolution has never been about individual survival. It's about the survival of your genes. Since at least the late 20th century, we tend to view organisms as vehicles for their genes. They are temporary, they are expendable. The organism is of no value except as perpetuating and transmitting genes. The only things that survive, individuals never survive in the long term, only the genes do. So we interpret behavior, the adaptive behavior, as being directed towards the propagation of those genes, not for some kind of individual fulfillment. Our instincts of pleasure and pain, or what's good or what's bad, are all shaped by what's beneficial for the genes and what isn't, right? So these females are, or the males, are perhaps not consciously striving to perpetuate their ethnic group or anything of the sort. They're just following their instincts, right? And their instincts are guided by this genetic selection. They may not be aware of what they're doing, but they will have inherited different proclivities. Like you saw the poem of Horatio at the Bridge. He wasn't talking about Y chromosomes, right? He didn't know about Y chromosomes, but he has instincts that make him respond differently than a female would. That's what I'm saying. And that our behavior is unconsciously directed towards the propagation of these genes. And as an evolutionist, what I look at is what genes do and do not get propagated. Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah, yes, that does make sense. And so what you're effectively saying, whether the woman is successful, you don't mean as a person, you mean that she's
No.
successful in the propagation of her genes.
No, it probably it was tragic for her as an individual
Yeah.
to be
Okay.
conquered, enslaved, possibly raped, you know. This was unpleasant, right? But the question is, what was she going to do about it? Was she going to fight or was she going to surrender? And the evidence is that most women throughout human history have, in fact, surrendered. There have been a few examples, like Boudica in Britain, that rebelled and she resisted, but you know what happened to her. She was not successful. Her and her entire tribe, the Iceni, were wiped out by the Romans, right? So normally it's been a bad idea, right? Now for the males, they may lose, but they really have nothing to lose, because if they lose it all, genetically speaking. Yeah. They may survive in a state of enslavement, but ultimately their genetic material goes by the wayside, you see, right? And the conquerors get the land, the riches, the women, all of that, they get it. And they're the ones that we see get to propagate their Y chromosome. Nobody is doing this because of genetics. I don't mean to, what do you call it, imply that in any way. At a conscious level, this is not what humans are thinking, okay? Nevertheless, evolutionary psychologists make the assumption that that genetic selection is what is ultimately motivating the behavior, right? And therefore you see more males engage in warfare, right, than females historically in every human society, because they have greater genetic interests in doing so. It's not just fighting when you lose, but fighting and sometimes you win. And when you win, you get to spread your genes quite a bit.
Yeah.
Right? So that is worth the risk for some males to do that. That's what makes some males, not all, evolve to be warriors, right? Because it is beneficial genetically. Now, individually, you may get killed, as Darwin pointed out, but your tribe comes out on top. That's what Darwin said way back in 1871.
Thank you. Is that all right, Michael? I'll move on to
Yes,
the next.
no,
Yeah.
clarify that, yeah.
Edith, please go ahead.
Well, I'd just like to follow up on that because I don't think there can have been as much miscegenation as the statistics would seem to indicate. It's only now that there's mass miscegenation, but in the past, like Professor Dutton, I think, has indicated, most people married their third cousins. And even if they were conquered, the conquerors, the women who slept with the conquering men were a tiny minority. And you can see that in the fact that there's hardly any Roman DNA in the British gene pool. It's still 80% Western Celts. So the Iceni did win. You know, they didn't lose, and their DNA survived not only the Roman conquest, but the Viking conquest. There's hardly any Scandinavian DNA. There's hardly any Anglo-Saxon DNA. Why?
I'm sorry, but you're wrong. You're wrong
DNA.
factually. What you're saying is factually wrong. If you talk about total DNA, you're right. But if you do a more fine-grained analysis, okay, Anglo-Saxon Y DNA dominates in Britain, not Celtic, yes it does. The Y chromosome DNA disproportionately high. And also the I haplogroup, the R1b, which was the Anglo-Saxon dominate, and the I haplogroup, which is from Scandinavia, dominates on the east coast of Britain, what used to be the Danelaw, where the Danes invaded and colonized. There is a disproportionate amount of Scandinavian Y haplogroups, right? That is just the facts. Now, the total DNA remains relatively constant, but you have to look at the sex bias propagation, right? And there is quite a bit of foreign DNA that is not Celtic in origin in Britain, and this is repeated throughout the world. I mean, you saw the quantitative evidence. This is
how do you have ethnic diversity then? How come we're not all one sort of brown sort of soup? You know, I mean, that's our future, because now with travel, there's much more miscegenation, there's much more, or intermarriage or whatever you want to call it, because of travel. And I mean, it could even lead to extinction of humans because ethnic diversity is a great strength. But how come it's been maintained over the centuries? If there was
because you weren't in Britain, let's take Britain as an example, which you're obviously familiar with. You weren't invaded by everybody. You weren't invaded by Mongols.
Yes,
you weren't invaded by Arabs or Bantu. You were invaded by Anglo-Saxons and Scandinavians. So that's what you see there.
No, but if you
You're
go
not going to become brown that way.
You can see the Berbers are distinct. You know, you only have to look at their faces.
That's right.
And you can tell the Berbers. Go to Afghanistan, which is a great crossroads, or Turkey. You can see the ethnic diversity there. Not everybody looks the same. It's not all a sort of muzak.
I never said they did.
Most people, whether they're male conquerors or female slaves or whatever, they prefer to marry their third cousins. And they always have done. And if they want to survive, they always will.
That's one paper that okay, yeah, on average they're the third cousin or similar seems to be the sweet spot, but there's all kinds of variation in
well, of course, yes, there's variation.
Right.
I don't want to sound racist, but I really, you know, I cannot stand this idea that there's been a sort of drive towards miscegenation from the year dot. It's not the natural way for humans of either gender to behave.
But it is.
They prefer to marry their own kind.
People do marry their own kind on average in small settled communities, but you also get invasions throughout history, and when those invasions happen, then there is a sex bias in who ends up having sex with who.
I agree, for a small minority.
So yeah, but it's.
So why don't we all look like Romans then, or Normans?
I don't know.
Why don't all the Chinese look the same as the Han Chinese? They don't.
I don't know what that means as a question. Why do we look like Normans? I don't know what it means.
Yeah, I mean, Edith, the DNA sort of map of Britain has been quite extensively sort of charted, and the results are interesting and are fairly consistent with what we know about history. I mean, it is the case that the percentage of so-called Anglo-Saxon DNA is maximal in England, and it reduces to a minimum in Ireland, which is what one would expect. And in England, it's maybe 35%, something like that. But the majority of the rest is is what's called pre-Celtic DNA. So there is, I mean, that's the overall message of these studies, is that there is extraordinary continuity, really. So I think it's kind of supporting what you're saying in some sense.
Oh, okay, good. Sorry, I got alarmed, you know, because
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just Europeans. I mean, you know,
these kinds that you talk about, they're not stable. I mean, there was a time when there was no such thing as the Pacific Islander race. It didn't exist. Like 6,000. There was a time when there was no such thing as the Eskimo race, the Arctic. They didn't exist. They weren't a separate race by any measure. They didn't exist. So these ethnic groups change, and they undergo mixing. And I mean, if you look at like the Uzbeks, they are a cline between different races. That's what the Uzbeks are. So it's evident that you get these intermixtures from the existence of these clines.
One more remark, if I can.
So I'll just allow Edith just to respond to that, and then perhaps we can. Sorry, go on, Edith.
Oh, well, I probably got the wrong end of the stick. I'm not saying there's been no mixing, of course not. And of course, you know, the Germans, when they invaded France, had a lot of French women. But I mean, I just got the impression that it was being suggested that was the norm for all human ethnic groups. And
No, I was only talking about,
No.
I was talking about events, specific historical events of conquests and migrations. Those are not the rule in human history. They happen every so often. I was asking what happens during those events. And what happens during those events is asymmetrical mixing. That doesn't mean that those events dominate human history. They do not.
Oh,
okay. Most of the time, you're right. People marry, more or less, people who are intermediately related to them. That is true. But then when you get overrun by another ethnic group, and that happens sometimes, not always, that changes things. And I'm saying what happens when that occurs. And what happens when that occurs is regulated by Dutton's rule. I think there is no doubt based on the evidence.
Good. Well, could I just slightly turn the conversation in a different direction? Would you say it's a reasonable understanding of Dutton's rule that it's generally the case that men are attracted towards women who are physically attractive? I mean, to put it in a really crude sense, men are more animated by sex and women by status and money.
That's correct, yes. But another thing that's different is that, well, not everybody, I don't want anybody to take offense, but historically, men like to have more than one woman. So they will very often, if they're in the position of conquerors, acquire more than their fair share, right? So you get a disproportionate representation of whatever higher status ethnic group is around. Dutton was doing his study in Finland, in a Christian country with legalized monogamy, right? Bigamy, as far as I know, or polygyny is illegal in Finland. So this was not the case in the contemporary data. But in historical societies in the past, there was no such limitation. So they could acquire, the conquerors or the upper status men could acquire quite a bunch of females and disproportionately breed. Now, not all of this was voluntary. Women may prefer to mate with their third cousins or whatever, but sometimes they are not permitted to do so, especially when they're under foreign domination. then they're not allowed to act on their preferences, right? They are essentially coerced directly or indirectly to mate with the dominant group.
I have to go to bed now, but thanks a lot, AJ, and thanks everybody. It was a very interesting presentation.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us, Ed. Much
Okay.
appreciated.
Good night, good night, good night, good night.
Sleep well. Bye
Good
bye.
night.
Bye bye. Yeah. There was a question in my mind that's just escaping. Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else who's perhaps not spoken? Oh, I'm not sure who had. Peter, I think, slightly may have had the hand up first.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the politics. It actually brings a lot of things like feminism, all this type of thing regarding.
I'm sorry, you're breaking out. You're breaking up. I cannot understand what you're saying.
Yeah. Restate your question, please, Peter.
Would you please be louder? Maybe speak more loudly.
Can you hear me? Okay. I was thinking about the politics of this in respect to how this stuff, which is fairly evident in history, how it applies now, today, as it were. So if you look at the history of it, then you can say that invaders, who were mainly guys, would effectively take women as booty.
Yeah.
Actually, it's quite a feminist. It does suggest the patriarchy, and it sort of gives this sort of idea of history as being a pretty brutal.
It was, but see, right now in the Christian West, taking women as booty is illegal.
Yes.
You know, if you're an American soldier stationed in Iraq and they catch you gathering up Arab women to make a harem for yourself, you will be court-martialed. You know, it is illegal. So it may not apply to our contemporary rules of war, but it applied for thousands of years to the way we used to do things. But you can't get away with that now. You can't do that now. So if you're thinking about it, let it go, because you'll be arrested. You know?
So it doesn't necessarily apply in the hard form. It doesn't apply in the hard form. So have you looked at, say, Silicon Valley in America, where you have lots of high status men from, say, India? When they arrive in America, do they local wives? But that's, I mean, is the same rule applying now? Is the same sort of conqueror system working, or have the feminists, for good or bad, actually broken this system?
No, the feminists have had no effect whatsoever. Most women pay no attention to that propaganda. And if they want a high status guy, they'll get one. And they continue to be just as interested as they always were. Now, of course, there's feminists that don't go along with that, but I've known feminists that also prefer high status guys. So, you know, they may talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk. Feminism has had no impact on this pattern.
Well, women now have their own jobs and have their own careers and their own property, and
but they still prefer guys that are even wealthier than them. They still do.
that was something that who was the, no, it's not Putnam, it's who's the sociologist in America who was,
Peterson.
yeah, it was, there was a famous study by, it was a chap he's been attacked, it was the bell curve chap. He wrote a book about it.
Oh yeah, Herrnstein and Murray.
Yeah,
there's two of them,
Murray.
but yeah,
Murray did
only one of them is still alive. Murray's still alive.
Yeah.
So you think that the it still applies today? It doesn't apply in the sense that you can't go and get a harem.
Yeah, but there's still female hypergamy. It's still prevalent. You can find out from any dating service or whatever. Most women will not accept a man that is of lower social status than themselves.
And this, in terms of pure politics, in terms of being, say, a British guy in Britain, where we have lots of waves of immigrants, say. How would this apply in that situation? So, I mean, you're still not necessarily, unless you have waves of high status immigrants who are, I'm talking theoretically here. So unless you have that, there wouldn't be any real danger, would it, in terms of your
Well,
model?
it depends. It depends. Even though you're not allowed to marry a bunch of women in Britain, okay, as far as I know, past the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell, nobody really regulating who you sleep with. And high status men still tend to have sex with a lot more women than lower status men, even though they're not allowed to marry them anymore. Okay, so it's still going on. Now, I'm not derogating Britain, but you need a very strict puritanical society to prevent, you know, men and women from pursuing these proclivities. And as far as I know, the only period that really cracked down on this was the Puritan Revolution. But even then, Cromwell himself had mistresses, you know, so, you know, there's a little bit of hypocrisy
really?
there.
Oh my goodness.
What's that?
No, I was a bit shocked to hear that. Cromwell had
Look it
mistresses.
up. You look it up.
Royalist propaganda for sure.
On that bombshell, no.
Britain has had his hand up
Actually,
forever. You know?
I'm amazed. Yeah, I mean, that's the last thread of belief in any kind of consistency among human beings. My goodness. I don't believe it.
Adam, did you have a question? It's going. Sorry.
Yes, first I must say it's been a fantastic Moot, but I must, I've got an early start tomorrow with plenty of harassment at work, so I must draw a stump soon. But I would like to say, just on the, it's made me think from what I've seen within our living time. I used to live in Australia, and I've visited New Zealand a couple of times as well. There is a definite proclivity for both Aboriginal women and Maori and South Sea Islander women to always maximize their chances of getting a white European partner. And it's so noticed over there, and it is so commented on amongst the male Aborigine and the male Maori as well. So
they don't like
their
that.
own lifetime.
That is absolutely accurate. And there's nothing specific about those groups. What I'm saying is this is a human universal. This is the way humans everywhere have always behaved, you know? So I'm not picking on any groups. I'm saying the lower status group women want to marry up, and you can't blame them. You know?
Linda, do you have any thoughts to or comments?
No, not really.
Oh, okay. I
must go and search for some high status men.
High status man, yes. Right, yeah, I think no comment on that. You know, no comment on that.
12 cats just is no good anymore. I'll just go searching.
I don't know whether you're in the right place or the wrong place for that. I don't know, but
I think I'm quite happy with the cats. All I want is a camper van. I don't want a high status man unless it's a high status man with a camper van. Then that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, camper vans are, you know, particularly the old style ones, are very, very, you know, high in demand. Definitely. Very stylish, very nice.
No, I do actually. Just a question about. I'm interested in the words, the lexicography that you did with regards to the finding moral foundation words that you call them individual.
Yes.
You're saying you looked at Britannic and Gaelic words. Have you done any research in the early or pre-Britannic? You know, like the Old Irish, Old Welsh, old Gaelic words. Looking into.
I wish I could, and if you have the expertise, I would love to work with you on it. But the trouble is, I don't speak those languages, right? So I can't really compile a dictionary. That's number one. And number two, I don't know that Google Ngram has those data.
Okay.
Maybe they do. I don't know. But since I don't speak those languages, it's all like, even if I look, I don't know what I'm looking at. So anyone that would like to collaborate on this, contact me. I'm a researcher. I'm always looking for opportunities to expand these horizons, but I have personal limitations, in what language I speak, what languages I speak, and also there is a limitation of what's in the database in Google Ngraph. They may not have taken old Gaelic stuff, or maybe they have, I don't know.
Well, I worked
But
on
anybody who has an idea, I'm up for it.
worked
I'm
on
excited by these things.
a Lexis project, but it was to do with it was gathering of words from Old Irish, Old Welsh, early Old English, but it was all connected to it was collected the illustrated manuscripts, so it was all to do with textiles mainly and domestic textiles. So it didn't go beyond that, but because there was nothing, like you said, there was nothing on Google or nothing there that we could work with. They just had to physically gather the experts from around the world and bring them together to put that together. But it was an AHRC funded project, so the money was there to bring the experts together, which is one of the problems, is getting those people to come together. But there was nothing, there was nothing digitally. That was what a project that had to come together just manually, really.
Yeah, that's the problem. So if you want to do this, contact me. I'm easy to find. I'm a large target and I don't move very fast. So I would love to do all these other, biocultural groups, right? I'm particularly interested in the Celts. Genetically, I'm predominantly Celtic myself, so I would love to do this, the part of Spain where my ancestors originally is called Galicia. Guess what that word means? They still have bagpipes over there. So I would love to do it, but I don't have the expertise. I'm just being honest, about what I can and can't do. But with people that have the expertise, I would love to be able to work with whoever is up for this.
Right, that's very good. I think that time is getting on. Quite a few people have left because they need to go to bed early. Just before we wind down, I wonder if either Vladimir or Mick, or I don't know whether Heather is still. I think she's maybe left. I don't know whether those who've not asked questions. Do you have Mick or Vladimir? Do you have any points to make or questions before we wind up things?
No.
Oh, okay. Vladimir.
Well, actually, no, it was interesting conversation. Yes.
Oh, yes. Oh, good.
Thank you for to the speaker for interesting talk.
Thank you.
Really.
It's always good to have you with us, Vladimir, and I always enjoy hearing your rich sonorous voice. So that's good.
Thank you.
It's pronounced Vladimir, isn't it? Vladimir?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
In Slavic form, Vladimir, but in you can say also Vladimir or Valdemar.
I see.
I may say that Vladimir had taken to using his name with reference to the mythic giant whose dismemberment has led to the creation of the world by calling him sort of Vlad Emir, which was quite an interesting move, I think. But right. I think but Michael, was that oh no, I think Michael was just waving goodbye. So right, let's close the meeting now. I must thank AJ for preparing such putting the material into such a good comprehensible order with well chosen slides. It was good to quote the 9 noble virtues. That worked really well, and I think we've all come away from tonight being more knowledgeable than we were before on a very important topic. So many thanks for you. And if anyone wants a download of AJ's book, please get in contact with me and I can forward it. Now I'll just say a few words in Old Norse, blow out the candle and wish everyone good night. At kväldi ska daglöj för kono prende makiagrunder moja givne ise keme öldrucket och att något ska prödlöjfa. Sigur för oss. Sigur frider oss. Blessed gods of our peoples and lands, at evening shall one praise the day, and at night shall one praise the evening. We offer thanks for what we profited by and for what we found pleasure in. Thank you so much, both to you, AJ, and to everyone who participated and who made very, very good questions and added to the whole energy of the evening. And thanks, Maya, for coming on for the first time. Good to have you here. So with that, I wish everyone a good night, and for you, AJ, a good day, because you're not going to bed now, are you?
No, it's only 2 p.m. in the afternoon.
Yeah. Yeah. All right then. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Bye bye, everyone.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Thanks, AJ. Thanks, Ted. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.